Joining me today is one of SpecPac's original founders and director. Glenys and her husband David have been at the helm of SpecPac since her husband brought his concept to life over 3 decades ago, back in 1986. As the 1962 national champion for the 100-yard dash, Glenys left a promising sprinting career behind and used her need for speed to produce specification templates to assist architects across Australia in authoring their specifications. Products that are still widely used and respected across the construction industry to this very day. Glenys, thanks for joining me. Lovely to see you again.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
No worries at all. So, okay, well, let's delve into this new content set, or before we do, I just want to ask for your customers or past customers and all the potentially new customers tuning in, can you please give us just a brief run through of how SpecPac was founded?
Yes, David was a practicing architect, and in 1985, he had to write his first specification using NatSpec. And he was a bit taken aback by the encyclopedic approach to spec writing. Mind you, it was probably much better than the cut and paste pattern which prevailed at the time. But in his opinion, it produced a very an unnecessarily complex specification. And he felt there could be something simpler and faster and easier to use that was minimalist in its approach rather than trying to include everything. And so that gave rise to SpecPac. It took him about 5 weeks to write it, and he wrote it over the summer holidays and launched it in 1986, and it was instantly very successful.
Okay, so back in 1986, what was the specification landscape like? Do you remember, I suppose with 3D modeling and BIM still a myth and quite some years away at that point, how important was the specification to a company, a CAD drawing when providing handover documentation? Did builders actually read specs back then, or is that just, I suppose, the common trend these days?
Well, I think there probably was a bit more reading going on back then, but I suppose what we need to really understand is the context for those who haven't been around that long. Way back then, drawings were all AO. They were very big drawings. They had the notion that the contract documents consisted of the contract, the drawings, maybe renderings, and a specification. And unless you had all of those, it really was an incomplete submission. And so specifications were very much part of the landscape. The other thing to realise about that time is there was a lot more architectural supervision on site than there is routinely today.
Let's expand a little bit on that in terms of the importance of the specification. Why do you think we need them, and what purpose do they serve in the construction sector?
Well, it's an interesting thing, but I think there was a pecking order which elevated the architect more in the 80s than can happen now. And so there's almost the notion that it's more important now than it ever was, that it is actually the designer's voice. And I think the specification is vital and is often undervalued because architects generally are visual people, and they're designers, they're artists, they want to create something beautiful. But the irony is that unless there's a specification, you can't be sure that your vision is going to be fully realised. You're going to get some sort of compromise result. I think there's actually more to be said about the importance of the specification. It seems to me, as a communication conduit, that you can't trivialise it in any way, that it's got to fulfil that purpose and realise what its function is. And I think it has, there's three, I was thinking about it the other day, there's 3 Ps for me. It's like it's professional. It's got to be a professional document. You've got to realise that it's part of your trade profession to be able to do this. Not only is it consistent with tradition, but it can bridge that gap. If architects are on site less, they need to have their voice on site. And it's through the specs that he can specify quality, which he can't do on the drawings, especially now as they're often A3. They're not even as big as they used to be. So you don't want really cluttered drawings trying to include the standards and all the other data that you might have to put on it to get anything like a quality job. I think the next thing is that they're very practical because there is less clutter on the drawing, and because it is the designer's voice or presence there, which is to be taken into account by the contractors. It's on what's to be supplied and installed and how in some cases, particularly with proprietary products. And the third P would be prevention or protection, because we live in a very litigious environment, and the architect is right at the front of the firing line if something goes wrong. And you know, if it's written, it's true. You did say it, and I think that needs to be realised by all architects, that if it isn't written, it isn't true, and it didn't happen.
Yeah. So, in those three P's, I think sometimes architects tend to focus on one of those P's, not all three at once. And I suppose since MBS expanded into Australia, and including on 3 years now, we've held discussions with hundreds of practices, you know, ranging from sole traders to the largest architectural practices in the nation. And still amazes me that specifications seem to be treated in almost the same way. And the concept design and drawing is obviously the glamorous side of architecture, and often the model is the focus, and specifications are almost an afterthought. You know, a copy and paste from a past project that may resemble a new one. With all the brilliant software and tools out there these days, why do you think it is that, you know, architects haven't necessarily moved out of Microsoft Word yet, but they're still comfortable trawling through pages of rehashed specifications and, you know, hoping they remember to take out clauses or leave them in, or to cross-reference out-of-date NCC standards? Is this just a habit thing, do you think?
Well, I think I have to be, I can't afford to be critical of Microsoft Word, since we used it successfully for many years after the initial scramble of trying to determine which of the word processing packages that were on the market was going to be the survivor, which was a real toughie in the 1980s.
Yes.
But I think Microsoft Word did serve its purpose. People are using it because it's easy, it's familiar. As you say, they can cut and paste easily. It's habit. And I think the other thing that it addresses is the lack of experience, especially among young architects, and the lack of the knowledge base and the confidence to actually write specs. That there's a tendency to fall back on what's already been done and just regurgitate it. The trouble is that if they don't have a good spec basis, they can't protect themselves from things like product substitution. Or imported products which don't comply with Australian standards and all this sort of thing. But I think ultimately they need something more sophisticated now than Microsoft Word.
Why did you feel comfortable that MBS was the right fit for SpecPack to live on? You know, the content sets, we've obviously brought in SpeedSpec first, and we've had some great feedback already from the industry now, and we've finally got SpecPack live, and it's similar feedback really. But in terms of how you felt comfortable with the content and where it was going with MBS Chorus, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, we did see, I was particularly aware of the fact that this platform, something of this nature on the cloud, was going to be the next generation of spec writing, and we were either going to be part of it or we'd become extinct with the passage of time. And I was very delighted really that NBS was here, because for several reasons. They tick many boxes. One, the fact that they've been around for many, many decades, and they're specialists in the field of specifications, which is really point one. Point two, their platform is comparatively easy to learn, and I think the fact that people who've used our products before are already familiar with the content, they only have to learn half as much. They've just got to learn how to use the new system. Exactly. But I think another box is that really your products give our clients and new clients resources they haven't thought of asking for yet. And I think that means they're going to be taken into the future. They're going to be very well looked after. They're going to grow into the product in a sense and realise how it services them. And I can see, you know, there's consistency and uniformity, and it's updated, for which I'm truly grateful. I'm not involved with it myself. But I think, you know, that it's got a very long future, and I think people are going to be very happy with what they've done. The other thing that is pleasing for me is that I can see ultimately that they can do here what they've done in the UK and integrate it with manufacturers and suppliers, and all that data can be there. And the fact that the architect has fantastic control over his product. With Microsoft Word, we knew copies were leaking all over the profession, and, you know, we were getting left by the wayside, and this can't happen. The architect has control over his documentation. He can get engineers to embellish the mechanical sections or whatever on his authority, and it's opened so many doors. I think it's a great solution, and we're overjoyed about it. So